The solution to the problem we're facing here is that we need to manage more of our authentication related state, and also the state that only matters to this component here, in our NGRX store. To be precise, we should at least manage whether we succeeded or failed. Well, we are managing the success case here with the login action, which leads to the reducer creating a user object. We should also add a login fail action. Let's export a new constant, login fail. The value can be auth login fail here. And let's create a new class for that as well. Export class login fail implements action. And here the type will be, the read-only type will be equal to login fail. We might also want to have an error message. So let's also add a constructor with a payload. And the payload here is just a string, could just be our error message. Of course, you could also use an object with more data here if you wanted to, whatever you want. With the login fail action added here, we also have to work on our reducer and what we manage in the state here. A potential login error should be managed here, since we also have that login error action. Hence, I will add a new property to my state here, of error, which should just be a string here, just a message. And here in the initial state, of error, therefore, could just be an empty string, but I will go with null. So initially we have no error. Now in the reducer, when we did log in successfully, I also want to set of error back to null in case it was something different. And I want to do the same when we start logging in. So it's time for a new case where we access our auth actions and use login start. Because whenever we start a new login process, I essentially want to copy my old state and I want to set auth error back to null because we have a new chance of logging in. Of course, we don't want to start with an error right away. Now to avoid this error which I'm getting here, I have to go back to the auth actions and add all these new actions to the union type down there so that they can be handled in the reducer without errors. So here we have login start, we have login fail. With that added here in auth reducer, we get no error anymore. We added login start. Now, of course, we also need to handle the fail case now. So the login fail case here. In that case, we also should return a new state based on the old state, where we probably want to set the user to null because logging in failed. So I see no scenario where we would have a user. And then set auth error equal to action payload like this, because payload already is a string. It already is the message I want to use. So now we're handling that in the reducer, this login fail case and the login start case. We have an auth error property in our state, therefore. Hence, now we can simply subscribe to that in the auth component to be informed about potential errors we're getting. For this, instead of subscribing to our auth observable here, I'll comment this out. Therefore, signing up will, for the moment, not work. But instead of doing that, I will select my auth part of the store and subscribe to that. And of course, here we get our auth state object. And we could use a map operator before that to extract the data we want. In that auth state object here, we get the current user and we also get our error if we have any. Now, I will actually now revert a bit and actually manage the loading state here in the reducer or in the NGRX state as well. So loading is a Boolean here. And initially loading is false. And I'm managing it here now because this simply makes it easier and less error prone to update the UI correctly. And now the idea simply is that once we're done logging in, I'll set loading to false. So when we are done, I will also set loading to false if we are done with an error, because even then we're done. We have an error, but we're not loading anymore. And just when we started, I'll set loading to true. So now loading is also managed in the NGRX state. And that makes it now easier here in the auth component to update the user interface correctly. Because then we should not subscribe to our store here after we submitted the form, but instead in ng on init. So let's implement on init, which needs to be imported from @AngularCore. So therefore we now have to add the ng on init method here. And in there, I set up my subscription to the store. And now we can set up this is loading and set it equal to auth state loading, because in the auth state we'll always have the latest loading state. And an error can also be set based on the auth state. So here we have our auth error, and I store that in my error, which I then use in the user interface. Please note that, for example, isLogin mode would also be a state that affects the user interface that is not managed inside of NGRX, because it doesn't affect any other part of the application. Logging in, of course, does, but whether we're in the login or sign-up mode and which form to display, that really only matters to this component, so there is no sense in putting that into the NGRX store. You could do it, but you don't gain much by it. Managing this entire auth flow in NGRX, however, is a different thing, because that does impact the entire application in the end. And therefore, here, now we're updating the UI based on the current state we have in our NGRX store. We are dispatching our login start here. The missing piece is that we redirect once we are logged in, so once we do have a user. And where would we now do that? We could, of course, try redirecting whenever we have a user. So we check if auth state user, if that is true-ish, and then we use this router navigate, and we navigate away. But we could also end up in weird scenarios where we kind of visit the page with a user, even though that shouldn't really be possible, and we have a strange redirection. And you could, and that's more important, also see navigation as a side effect. Of course, it impacts your application, but it doesn't impact your state. The state of the application and what the user sees, yes, but your data state, so to say, that's not really impacted. So let's redirect with the help of NGRX effects as well. No worries, we're coming closer to having a working setup with NGRX effects for authentication. As always with NGRX, it's a bit more initial setup, but once it is set up, other pieces can easily be added. So now I want to redirect once we're done authenticating, once we're successfully done authenticating, from inside auth effects, because, as I just explained, you could see such a navigation as a side effect. For this, in the auth effects, let's add a new property, auth success, which has a value of this actions pipe there at auth type, and I want to react only to my login action here when I successfully did log in. Now this needs the add effect decorator, and as an additional step, after filtering for the type, I will add the tab operator, which therefore needs to be imported from RxJS operators. And in there, I simply want to execute a function where I use the Angular router to redirect. For that, we should inject the Angular router here. So inject router from @Angular router. With that injected, let's use it in here by calling this router navigate. And then here I'll go to the root route. Now, of course, you could argue that the route you want to go to differs, and you don't always want to go back to just /. Then you could, of course, accept that information as a payload on the action you're reacting to, for example. What's really important here, though, is that this is an effect which does not dispatch a new action at the end. I mentioned that typically your effects do that. They typically return an observable which holds a new effect which should be dispatched. This effect doesn't. And to let NGRX effects know about that and avoid errors, you have to pass an object to your add effect decorator where you set dispatch to false. And this lets NGRX effects know that this is an effect which will actually not yield a a dispatchable action at the end. And then you can do that just like this. Also note that I used the login action, which only fires on a successful login, not as soon as we start the login process. With all of that, let's try logging in again. We see the spinner, and we get an error. Auth effects off login dispatched an invalid action. And that's indeed an error from my side. Whilst we need to create an observable with auth and catch error, inside of map automatically wraps what you return into an observable. So here, it actually returns a new observable with our auth created observable. And that's wrong. So here we just need to return our new action, not wrapped into auth, because otherwise we're creating a double observable, so to say. Tiny mistake on my side, don't use auth here. With that out of the way though, now if we try logging in again, see the spinner, and we're there. Now let's log out and let's try logging in with the incorrect password. And we're getting the error, but we're not really getting an error message here. So this is still not working correctly. We still have to implement that. The error case here can't work because if we're catching an error for logging in, which we're doing, we're returning an empty observable. And hence, this does never dispatch anything that would, well, store our error. Now actually we prepared everything we need. We got our login fail action, and in the reducer, we're reacting to it, and we're storing the payload of that action in the auth error, which we then in turn try to use in the auth component to hopefully show the error message. Now there are two missing pieces. One is in the auth component, actually for showing an error, we have to call show error alert to use our dynamic component and not just set this error, but that's a tiny thing. In here, I simply check if this error is truish, and then if it is, I call this show error alert and forward this error. So that's one thing. The more important thing is that in the auth effects, we of course need to return our action here. Now here inside of auth, because catch error, unlike map, does not automatically wrap what you return into an observable. So here you need to create your own one. Still here, the goal is to create a new auth action, the login fail action, and this requires a payload which is the error message as a string, and that's not just error like this, but instead if we have a look at auth service, here you see in the past, we called this handle error when catching an error, and in handle error, we got the full error response, and from the error response, we then extracted some data and generated our own error message. So essentially I want to copy that logic here from the auth service into auth effect like this. Error here is nothing else but our error response. So we can access error and so on there. Now what we must not do, however, is call throw error here because as I explained earlier, your effects here should never return errors that break the observable. Instead here, I also call auth, and I create a new auth action login fail with the dummy error message we have up there. Otherwise, we get a more specific error message, and we pass that to login fail down here. Now we have better error handling code in place, and now let's try logging in with incorrect credentials, and I'm getting my modal here. We can try again, so our main observable is not dead, and therefore now if I try my different combinations, this all fails, but once I try the right credentials, I can log in. And now this was a lot of work, but now we're using NGRX for logging in. And again, as before, and as I mentioned it before, it is a lot of initial setup work, and it's definitely something to wrap your head around, but thereafter you have a clean flow here. We will be able to soon get a lot of the logic out of our auth service. And then again, we're entirely in the NGRX world. And as you will see, adding new effects will be now much faster than this first initial setup.